Welcome to today's investigation of ancient Egyptian fashion for the honors class, What We Leave Behind, a history of architecture, fashion, and decor. I'm Julie Levitt-Learson, your costume design prof. What do you picture when you think about ancient Egyptians? Mummies? Pharaohs? Gods? Probably most of us picture this gold and lapis lazuli mask of King Tutankhamun from his pyramid tomb. But this society is far more complicated than this one kind of iconic image lets on. One great thing about the ancient Egyptians is that they were kind of master time capsule keepers, right? Their tombs were basically time capsules. And while many of them have been ransacked over the centuries, we still have quite a bit of treasure left behind that can help inform our ideas about what life was like. They also left behind a lot of art. Even though this art isn't realistic in the way we would consider it today, we do get a good picture of what daily life might have been like for people of all classes in this society. So, what do we know about ancient Egypt's climate and geography and the biosphere? Right, we remember from our readings that much of Egypt is desert, but it's along a very fertile, flowing, long, deep river. So we've got a climate that's hot and sandy and dusty, with some areas that are hot and swampy and humid. And of course, this river, it teems with life. We've got birds and snakes and hippos and fish and crocodiles and gazelles and bugs and flowers and reeds and grasses. So how might that environment inform fashion? Fortunately for the Egyptians, growing right along the Nile was kind of the perfect resource to use as a textile. Our old friend here, linen. And linen was the basis for the bulk of their clothing. They didn't really wear fur and they considered wool unclean. And this makes sense, right? There are not a lot of furry animals nearby. And it is a hot and humid climate, which would make wool hot and scratchy. But linen, because it's this natural wicking property, is going to be perfect for a hot and muggy climate. And because it's so washable, you can dunk it right in the river. Herodotus, who was a Greek visitor to Egypt in the latter part of their heyday, said that the Egyptians valued cleanliness more than ornament. Given this detail from Tutankhamun's tomb, I'm not quite sure that I buy that. Definitely, Egyptians loved cleanliness, and so linen being a highly washable textile was perfect for that. But as you can see from this, they also appeared to be quite fond of color. And Egyptians were master weavers. They were quite good at weaving linen so fine it was practically transparent. Now, remember how labor intensive weaving is from the last lecture. So they were not into tailoring garments so much as they were into draping garments. So they would weave big rectangles of very, very fine linen that they could fold and tie and pin around their bodies. And they were also very fond of pleating to kind of make shape and drama and excitement to the garment. Now you notice the linen that's being woven here is kind of yellowish, but the weavers that are doing the weaving are in white. Same cloth. Linen, when you expose it to the sun, tends to kind of bleach naturally a little bit to a white color. We consider it more off-white today because we're used to chemical whiteners and bleaches in our textiles, but this would have been white to the eye back in ancient Egypt. And the Egyptians were not into dyeing their fabrics. There were not mordants readily available to them to stay in the linen, and linen really needs a mordant in order to keep that pigment in place. And so, given all of the washing that they did with the linen, it just wasn't worth it. So, they found ways to express their love of color in other areas. Here's an example of that very fine linen quality. Now, we can't take this outside to bleach it in the sun because it's so old it will probably disintegrate. So just imagine this a little bit closer to white because it has yellowed with age. but if you could imagine a big rectangle of this beautiful fabric draped around your body, you would probably feel cool and comfortable in the hot Egyptian sun. This is not to say that they couldn't sew garments together when they chose to, right? Here is our familiar friend, the Tarkan dress of pleated linen. So this is three rectangles that have been sewn into a T shape, one rectangle for the body and one rectangle for each arm that got slipped over the head. And this is obviously a much more practical garment than big draped rectangles of linen wrapped around the body. So perhaps this tells us something about class of the wearer. But even so, you can still see these beautiful, very fine creased pleats in this tunic. So I'm going to ask you to start making some comparisons for some slides coming up. So here is a statue of a couple from about 2400 BCE. Here's a statue of a couple from about 1800 BCE. And here's a statue of a couple from about 1350 BCE. So that's about 1,000 years or more of time passing. What do you notice about these three couples? Not much is changing, but there are some subtle differences. What do you think that says about these people? So this is basically quintessential Egyptian fashion for the whole period of that 1,000 years. Look at the silhouette on the man, the silhouette on the woman. Look at the lines, look at the texture and the color, and look at the accents. What do you make of these? And what about the human form as being revealed, concealed, or manipulated? For those of you that are interested, if you wanted to try this, this is how one might wear the basic shanty, which is a loincloth or a kilt. It's basically a triangle or rectangle of fabric that non-royal Egyptian men wore. They wrapped it around their midsection and held it in place with a belt, and they had various ways to do this. Here are some examples of that. Now, our man in this statue, a couple of slides back, he had kind of a stiffened apron, like triangle shape in the front, and that was called a shendite, which was worn by higher status men. And if you're a woman, here's how you might wear the linen fabric to make the basic garment of an Egyptian woman called a calasiris or calasiris. As you can see, big old draped rectangle held in place on the shoulder with probably a pin or a brooch. Okay, so here's an example of this from a painting, and it does appear very form-fitting and skin-tight, which would suggest to us either like spandex in the material or some real expert tailoring, which we've just said really wasn't the case here in ancient Egypt. So remember, painting is a little bit like photoshopping, and I think this is a little bit of an idealized version of what the body might look like in a garment. And here are a couple of more variations on that calasiris. You can see that plunging V neckline, which means this was probably attached with shoulder straps. And then the one on the right seems to be embroidered or patterned or painted, but probably what it is a layer of beads strung on a net worn over that plain linen tube. And here is an example of that beaded net dress, like a sheath worn over a calasiris. Some people seeing this in a tomb thought maybe women sometimes wore the beaded net dress without the linen underneath, but I would imagine that would be exceedingly painful and it would be heavy and uncomfortable. So probably they wore them over the linen layer, which makes a lot of practical sense. Later on, as we get closer toward that era called the New Kingdom, we kind of just add more fabric to these basic shapes. You can see here's a way, or a couple of ways, to wear this fuller calasiris of the New Kingdom, right? Same idea, just a little bit more elaborate. And here you can kind of see some layers, right? You can see that basic shanty and the calasiris through this other layer that appears on top of it that seems to be maybe more like a tunic or a robe. So this is a even more finely woven pleated linen worn over the regular layers. The more transparent the linen, the finer quality of the fabric that is, and the more costly the weave. So really a high status symbol here. And here's another example of those styles changing ever so slightly, right? As these garments get fuller and longer and more elaborate around the body, so do the hairstyles. And look, also, they look like they've got white nail polish on their fingers. So little, and on their toes too, right? So little tiny changes in style. In case you want to dress up like a royal Egyptian from the New Kingdom this Halloween, here is how you could drape that royal hag. And here's an example of that style kind of even becoming more extreme. You can see on the right-hand side, the shanty has become much longer and fuller. The overdrapes have become even blousier and more elaborate. And these people, we think this is from a brewery, a painting of what it's like inside a brewery. You can see they're drinking beer. So they have forgone to shave their heads. Fashion is always in motion, even when it seems like we're standing still. Okay, so if your basic silhouette is this tube or draped pleated shape, and your texture is this pleated linen, and your color of this textile is going to be almost always white, how are you going to create a little variety and some spice and some accent? Well, probably your jewelry, your accessories, and your hair. So let's take a closer look at those things. We know that ancient Egyptians mined gold and copper and jewels and other precious stones, and they could make colored glass that they called faience. So their jewelry was colorful and elaborate, and it was full of symbolism. They used lots of images of animals and flowers that were ever present along the Nile. They used images of the gods that they worshipped in their jewelry, and that was for protection as much as for decoration. So here's a pretty typical piece of jewelry, and please forgive my pronunciation. A yusuk, I think, is how you pronounce that. It's a wide collar. You can see it's made of many rows of beads, that glass faience, and some precious stones, and then tipped with gold, like hawk heads, falcon heads on the ends. And so this was a collar that was worn around the neck, like a really big statement necklace. This is a much simpler necklace called a pectoral, because it hung around the body on the chest, kind of designed to sit right on that breastbone. But again, while it looks simple compared to that big heavy collar, you can see there's lots of beautiful craftsmanship and artistry going on in there. And we've got the falcon symbols again and precious stones and gold. The pectoral was an amulet, right? And so it was supposed to be used for protection. Here's another example of those collars. Less expensive materials used here, but same kinds of ideas. And here's a necklace again with those faience glass beads, and you can see several little amulets on it. So this is almost like a charm bracelet. Here are a few examples of earrings. So Egyptians, both men and women, did pierce their ears and wore jewels in their ears. And they also made bracelets and arm cuffs. Again, beautiful workmanship, lots of details and symbolism worked in there. You can see the scarab beetle, you can see the gods, you can see wings and hieroglyphs, all heavy with meaning. And they also wore rings. I rather love these. You can see one's a little mouse. There's a scarab beetle again. We have an image of an eye, and then we have a sphinx. And then that one on the right-hand side looks like it could have been maybe used as a seal, dipped into wax and pressed onto paper. So you can see from all these examples of jewelry that is just a taste of what Egyptians had, that they loved color and they loved multicolored things, right? So once they were dressed in their white linen draped garments and then put on all of their jewelry, they could be quite a colorful figure indeed. Egyptians also had very distinct hairstyles. You can see some examples of them here in this statue. Now, Egyptians often styled their own hair, and they braided and coiled and arranged it in these kind of layered rows that you can see here, and then ornamented it with jewelry. But sometimes they shaved their own heads and wore wigs, or sometimes they cut their hair very short and wore extensions. It's hard to know how much of this is like personal preference, how much of this is for hygiene, and how much of this is for like wealth and status. But we have evidence of wigs in different materials, sometimes out of plant fibers like palm, sometimes out of wool, and sometimes out of human hair, which might have been their own that they grew out and cut or that they bought and then styled. Here's an example of a recreation, a reconstruction of a wig that was discovered in a tomb of the Middle Kingdom. And these gold rings had been left behind and remnants of the hair in it, and they kind of rebuilt with human hair in their best recreation of the style. Here's an example of an even more elaborate style. You can see the hair has been twisted and coiled underneath and then covered with this beautiful gold and kind of bejeweled head covering. And again, here's another reproduction of a wig that has even more elaborate gold bands that has kept the hair to really neat coils. And then that's been paired with a diadem, which is, a circle that goes around the forehead. And it has this like lotus flowers on it and a serpent. So this suggests to me a queen. And this is an original wig that was still found in its box in a tube. And you can see there are intentionally two different hairstyles combined into one wig. We've got the really tightly braided hair underneath and then the coiled blondish hair on top. And here is a distinct style for Egyptian children. They called this the lock of youth. They would shave most of the child's head and then just keep enough hair to make a little braid on one side. You can see if you're a pharaoh, that's going to be pretty elaborately bejeweled. If you're less than a pharaoh, then maybe you might not shave the whole head, but you're going to kind of swoop that hair over and braid it. Okay, so taking care of that hair, it's going to tend to dry out and you don't want it to attract bugs and you do want to keep it smelling nice. So cleanliness was important. You can see in this picture that kind of dome shape on top of this woman's head. We think that is a cone of perfumed incense, which would be ground herbs mixed with oil. And so it's sitting on top of the wig and her headdress. So in theory, this oil and perfume would kind of melt and moisturize the wig as it did so. But that sounds rather messy and uncontrolled. So we're not quite sure if this was a literal practice or this is just kind of like a symbol that this person has really excellent hygiene and smells beautiful and has amazing shiny hair. So in addition to both men and women using hair extensions and wigs and elaborate hairstyles, both men and women in ancient Egypt used various kinds of makeup. And it was a very distinctive style, right? We can think of that Egyptian kind of smoky eye as kind of iconic of their style. But the eye lining actually served a pretty functional purpose, right? So they would use kohl, Kohl, and sometimes green malachite brushed on the upper lid. But that was kind of a way to protect against sun glare. So almost like wearing, like how football players wear black underneath their eyelids to kind of keep the sun out of their eyes. Egyptians are doing the same thing. But the malachite also kind of helped repel tiny parasites, and so it helped ward off infection. And the red ochre on the lips, and they used moisturizers to keep their skin soft and protect it from the sun. And both men and women could paint their nails with henna. You can see the facial hair on the men. We haven't seen a lot of men with mustaches or beards. Egyptians tended to keep their body hair to a minimum. But you can see here on the right, maybe that's a little tiny vestige of a beard on that gentleman. You've probably noticed in most of the images of people where we can see their feet, they are barefoot. And Egyptians did go barefoot a lot, but sometimes they wore sandals. So you can see sandals made out of papyrus reeds, sandals made out of leather, and then these very ornate gold sandals with, beautiful artistry all over them. So it's kind of important to remember that Egyptian society was very hierarchical. We had several strata of class, and of course, the pharaoh and the royal family was at the top, and then at the bottom were the people that did the hardest and sweatiest and dirtiest work. So it was apparently important to Egyptians um, to kind of tell each other apart and where they fit into this hierarchy. So, how can you tell class in this society? Well, you start with the quality and quantity of linen, and you start with the quality and quantity of the jewelry, whether or not someone is wigged, what kind of materials are used in their footwear, how much makeup they can have on, and those kinds of things. So, remember the king and queens. In Egypt, we've got a pharaoh who was considered both a king and a god. And so a lot of their clothing was a display of wealth, a display of power, but also religious symbolism, especially in their headwear. So to return to our Mask of Tutankhamun, you can see a lot of that symbolism present here, right? The crook, that the pharaoh is kind of a shepherd guiding the people. Um, there's a false beard attached here, which is a symbol of both, virility. I am strong, I am powerful, I am masculine, and intelligence. And you can see the hair of this beard has been tightly braided and oiled and then curled into a little point. Many pharaohs probably wore false beards and didn't actually braid their own hair. This linen headdress kind of represents the mane of a lion. We've got the symbols of the cobra and the symbol of the vulture, kind of uniting both parts of Egypt into one. And then we've got that elaborate makeup, the kohl-lined eyes. We've got the flail in their other hand, which is a farming tool, right? But in gold and lapis lazuli, right? To symbolize that the pharaoh is the provider for the people. And then also you can see he's got pierced ears. Here's an example of that headwear, the symbolism, and the two goddesses are each representing part of Egypt, and they've got those two distinct headdresses, and then they combine them into one and put it on the pharaoh's head. So he is the leader of both Upper and Lower Egypt. Pharaohs also sometimes wore this blue crown, which I believe is pronounced kapresh. And this was a war helmet. So when a pharaoh was leading their people into battle, they would wear this special crown. And then kind of the less formal pharaonic crown is that striped linen headscarf, the nemes. You can see more examples of those false beards that I'm telling you about, right? You can see that it um, might be just the line of the jaw there on the right, but it also might be showing how the beard is attached to the face. Not quite sure. But we've got another crown here on the left. It's the two ostrich feathers. Now, this is a bust of Queen Hatshepsut, who was a pharaoh in her own right. Most of the time, the pharaohs were men, but sometimes women managed to do it. But here she is, female, and she's wearing the double crown. It looks like the serpent has been kind of like chipped off sometime over history, and she's wearing a false beard. So there she is, a bearded lady, which makes one wonder. We think about Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, who was kind of renowned for her beauty and her feminine wiles. But if she was doing the pharaoh thing, would she have also been wearing a false beard? And queens had their own special headwear as well. Here we have that diadem, that circle that goes around the forehead with some streamers made out of metal and jewels. And here on the right, we've got kind of a cylinder shape called the modius headdress, also decorated with gold and jewels. And here we've got a combination of the vulture crown and the two ostrich feathers for a queen. This vulture symbol was tied to the goddess Nephbet, who was the protector of Egypt, and she was also very special for females because she was the goddess of childbirth, mothers, and children. So very important symbol for the Queen of Egypt to be wearing. Of course, the vast majority of ancient Egyptians were not pharaohs. So here is a family portrait of statues of a family of a priest of the Old Kingdom. So still high society, highly placed in that, hierarchical pyramid, but not the pharaoh. So what differences do you see in their outfits compared to the pharaohs that I have been showing you? And what similarities kind of persist down through the ranks? Note we have a mom and a dad and a son and a daughter. And see how the children seem to be dressed identically to their parents. What do we notice about their jewelry? What do we notice about their hair? What do we notice about their footwear? And what do you make of these darker skin tones on the males than on the females? Remember that Egypt is in North Africa. It is on the Mediterranean and clear, next to the what we call today the Mid East. So skin tone was certainly darker than Northern European skin tones, but not as dark as countries further into the interior of Africa and further south, which you can see in paintings left by the Egyptians. The country of Nubia, which was further down the Nile, they presented people from Nubia as much darker skin toned than Egyptians. And here we have men as slightly darker hued than women in the same family. So what do you make of this? Here's a painting of a noble family from the New Kingdom, parents and children of various ages. So the adults are all clothed and they've got wigged, and the older child on the right-hand side, who's probably their firstborn son, is clothed and wigged, but not quite the same as the adults. And then we've got four small children with that lock of youth, but other than that, they are naked. Here's a painting of a noble family with some servants, and they're out hunting in the marshes. So check out their clothes, check out their makeup and their hair, check out what's on their feet or not on their feet, and what conclusions can you draw from this? And here is a painting. We're going kind of further down that pyramid hierarchy to some craftsmen, goldsmiths, and jewelers. Right, we've got the same silhouette as their more noble counterparts, but simpler hairstyles or no hair at all. You can see some bald, and very, very little jewelry, even though their job is making the jewelry. And here are some models of Egyptian farmers of the Middle Kingdom. So we're further down that hierarchy. Same silhouettes, even simpler styles. Here's a painting of an Egyptian noblewoman with her servants helping her style her hair and put on her makeup, put on her jewelry. So the servants are almost completely naked. They seem to have a belt wrapped around their hips, but they have some jewelry and they have rather elaborate hairdos. Even so, it's probably pretty easy for you to tell who is the higher status person in this painting. So within this hierarchy, we also have priests of various kinds, and I just wanted to show this as a quick example. Remember, I told you Egyptians really were not into fur. They viewed it as unclean, but there seems to be an exception here for priests. They are often depicted as wearing the skin of a leopard, like literally the whole body of a leopard draped over and around their body. Now, certainly Egyptians would have been in contact with leopards. They hunted leopards, but we wonder if maybe these weren't actually leather skins, but maybe it was linen that was painted to represent leopard skin and leopard fur. We're unclear. And we also have soldiers in this hierarchy. So they have special kind of occupation-specific clothing. These are pictures of gods in soldier gear, in armor. But I wanted to show you this kind of leather cuirass, which is this plated armor that's covering their torsos. And this is a remnant of that actual armor. You can see how they could be sewn together onto a fabric base, and then you've got, kind of like a police vest. But not all soldiers wore those leather cuirasses. Sometimes they just went into battle in their linen drape. Of course, if you were the pharaoh going into battle, here you are in all of your finery. You've got a really special, highly decorated, bejeweled cuirass with wings across it. And then you've got your blue war helmet on. So again, still showing your staff. And then here are some foot soldiers, again, in their linen shanty, maybe wigs, or maybe that's just their hairstyle. And we're wondering if maybe their wigs were padded a little bit with leather to kind of give them a little bit of protection. This is the end of the slideshow. I want to thank you for attention um, through this exploration. Do take your time, go back and look over these different images and give them a good study and kind of figure out what you understand about these people from having looked at what they have left behind of their clothing.